There
There
we
we
go. I think it's
go.
going now. Okay.
Yeah, I got the notice,
Yep.
so it looks
Okay.
good.
Yep. You're good then.
Wonderful. Yes, and I just have to shout out, thank you, Janice, so much for helping us coordinate so we can have this on the town webinar platform and have it linked to the town YouTube account so that it can be posted real time and also kept there as a recording. All right, so I am going to give a brief introduction. So welcome and thanks for joining us this afternoon. For anyone who hasn't met me yet, my name's Maggie. I am a scientist at FB Environmental, working with the Megunticook River Citizens Advisory Committee with their charge to engage the community in exploring resiliency outcomes on the river. I'm joined on screen here by my colleague Mindy, and our company lead forest is participating in the audience as well. So thanks for coming today. This is our fourth presentation in a monthly series of virtual webinar presentations on the third Tuesday of the month. So these will continue. And our hope is that during each of these presentations, we can focus on a different aspect of the river to help both the committee and the public better understand future management options on the river. So with that, our presentation this afternoon will be given by Ken Gross, who's on screen. Thanks for joining us, Ken.
Sure.
Ken is the steward of the Welsh History Center at the Camden Public Library. And Ken's talk today will be on a visual history of the Megunticook River, which is focused on the industrial past and the story of the river's mills and dams. So Ken's going to first cover a brief introduction to the glacial history of the region that really allowed the river's energy to be harvested as power for early settlers and entrepreneurs. And then Ken will move into an introduction of each of the historic mills, really relying on the 1856 and 1875 detailed maps of Camden, as well as the detailed Sanborn insurance maps from 1888 to 1923, which I can say, and I'm sure Ken will expand on for us. And at the end, Ken will also touch on the work he's done to try to uncover any history of sea-run fish, specifically alewives in the Megunticook, although that record is pretty scanty. So Ken's going to start with a 30-minute introductory presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity for question and answer. All questions today from everyone, committee and public, please submit through the Q&A, and I'll moderate those. The complete presentation will be kept to an hour, so we will end at 5:30. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we are live streaming to the town YouTube page right now, and it will remain posted there, so you can go back and watch it, or you can share it with your friends. And before I turn it over to Ken, I'll just introduce our committee members. We have 9 committee members guiding this project. So we have Ray Andresen, Courtney Cease, Deb Chapman, Elfie Owen, Ellen Reynolds, Tyler Smith, Seth Taylor, Rick Thackeray, and Susan Todd. And some of them are able to join us today. So with that, Ken, I'll turn it over to you and you can share your screen and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Maggie, and thank you all for tuning in this afternoon. I've been looking forward to sharing these images and this information with you, so thank you to the MRCAC, I love acronyms, Megunticook River Citizens Advisory Committee. I will do a couple of clicks here, and there we go. I hope that shows up.
It looks great, Ken. Thank you.
I have too many photos and too little time, so I'll lead up by saying that the impression I want to leave with you is of Camden as a mill town. Before Camden became a destination for tourists and retirees, it was an industrial powerhouse. In fact, there is an anecdote from N.C. Fletcher's History of Camden where he relates that the industrialists who built Lawrence, Massachusetts, first came to Camden. And they talked to James Richards, who turned them down flat. N.C. Fletcher lamented that they went elsewhere. Otherwise, we'd be Lawrence, Massachusetts. A lot of people have given me leads, links, and references on the Megunticook River over the past several months, so I need to acknowledge that I am relying on the work of many historians, naturalists, researchers, as well as historians from centuries ago, and current researchers whose work is online today. My slide does not seem to be advancing. Oh, there we go. And this first slide, I think, represents the history of the Megunticook River in a nutshell, even though the river itself is not even in the photo. This photo shows the empty shell of the Knox Woolen Mill. The photo was taken about 1988 by R. Barrett. This is the post-industrial view of the Megunticook River. In this image, the looms and spinning equipment have all been carted away, but you can still see the overhead shafts. These shafts and these wheels would spin. They were spun by the waterfall power, and these shafts distributed the power throughout the mill. You would throw a leather strap up over one of these wheels, pull the lever to tighten the strap, and the power would run your loom or your drill press or your lathe or fulling machinery or trip hammers or whatever you needed power for. This electrical outlet on the wall kind of gives you an idea of what having power meant. It was almost as easy as plugging in your power to an electrical outlet. Not quite as easy, but the mills often changed owners and often changed their products, but there was always reliable power if you were on a stream such as the Megunticook. Now we're going to jump back to the beginning of time. This is, we have a baseline of sorts because all of Maine was scoured down to the bedrock. In fact, much of the bedrock was scoured away by a mile-thick layer of glaciers. You can see the scouring here. This grain, which runs from basically northeast to south, northwest to southeast, is the direction of the glaciers, and you can see that the very shape of Megunticook Basin and Megunticook River was formed 10 to 14,000 years ago by the glaciers. I hope this shows up. You can see this flat area is Megunticook Lake, and this is the watershed of the Megunticook River. This is the course of Megunticook River. You can find this information yourself if you Google Maine LiDAR hillshade, and you can find all of the places in Maine where there is a LiDAR recording. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource. That was the macro view of the grain caused by glaciers, and here's the close-up view of the grain caused by glaciers. This is on a trail over Barrett Cove, looking straight towards that Mount Batty there on the horizon. Jumping forward several thousand years, I don't want to overlook the Native Americans. I was once visiting the Anasazi country above Santa Fe, and I spent the week crawling through the canyons above Santa Fe, and then I went down to Santa Fe and immediately went to the History Museum, where I found out that history started when the Spanish arrived. So I don't want to make that cultural mistake. So here's the information, some information about the natives on this part of the coast of Maine. Fanny Hardy Ekstrom in 1941 published the Indian place names of the Maine coast. She says that Megunticook probably meant big harbor, big mountain harbor. It was the name of the harbor, not the name of the mountain or the river. The name was later extended to a mountain, stream, and lake to which it does not belong, as Fanny Ekstrom notes. Megunticook is the very old Micmac or Maliseet name for the Indian village site at Camden. Megunticook is the more modern Indian name of Camden Harbor, and Megunticook is the old name of the exposed coast along the Lincolnville shore, dreaded by canoemen in rough weather because there was no avoiding it, except by a very long route far inland. For miles it extends in a rocky harborless coast, exposed to all the prevailing winds. This map is of 1764, and the map was, of course, not designed to show the points that I'm making here, but this is that rocky coast from Belfast down to Rockland Harbor. And I've been out kayaking there, and it is an unpleasant coast to canoe or kayak, as opposed to over here in Deer Isle. If you had your canoe up in Old Town, it was an easy paddle to go down this side of the Penobscot, up the Bagaduce, down to Walker Pond, a short portage to Eggemogan Reach, and then you were in canoe heaven over there in Deer Isle. Likewise, down around Pemaquid or Madomic Valley, the canoeing was much better. This was a challenging place for the Native Americans. The other thing I wanted to point out on this early map from 1764 is this mitten shape is Camden Harbor. And I have looked on every map that I could find for an outline of what Lake Megunticook looked like before the dam went in. So if any of you ever find a map that shows Canaan Pond before it was dammed, I'd love to see it. Send it around. Everybody would love to see it. But like this map shows, it's really hard to find. Now we'll jump forward another couple of centuries. Every historian, and that's literally for the Camden history, it's John Locke in 1859, N.C. Fletcher in 1884, and Reuel Robinson in 1909. They all took us on a tour of all of the mills and factories and dams on Megunticook River. Likewise, this is a well-known resource from 1869 that Walter Wells put together. This is an inventory of the water power available on the Megunticook River. And this is by way of showing that it was the resources that were important to the entrepreneurs and the settlers. They were all looking to make their livings based on what they found here in Camden or wherever they happened to settle. And water power was a vital and very important resource. So that's why there is an inventory made in 1869. And by 1869, of the 15 powers, that is to say mill sites or potential mill sites, 11 of them already had dams and mills on them in 1869. This base map is often used because it's one of the earliest and very nicest maps. This is 1856, and I have added these 7 mill sites. These are dams that exist, or dams either exist as complete dams or ruins of dams on the river today. So we'll start at the mouth of the river. This map is from 1912, but it shows what we now call the Montgomery Dam. This is Main Street here. This is the L-shaped dam that we call Montgomery Dam. And this is basically the seawall. This first dam was built by Major William Minot of Boston around 1771. He purchased the land and the water power rights from the 20 associates. And here is an early photograph from 1876 of this. This is the mill pond in the foreground, and then the water drops out away from us down into Camden Harbor. But we're standing on Main Street looking out over the mill pond and the harbor. Now we will jump to the far end of Megunticook and work our way downstream, starting at Megunticook Lake. John Locke in 1859 said the most valuable water privileges in town are to be found upon Megunticook Stream, which issues from Canaan Pond. This photograph is from 1899. And we do have a couple more photographs of the East-West Dam. I think this is the East Dam from a picture postcard. But this next photograph I really like because this is one of the few photographs, actually the only photograph I've seen, which shows both the East and West Dam. This building over on the right is the fish hatchery, which was built about 1903. So that gives you the era in which this photograph was taken. Moving downstream, this is the Seabright Dam, this is the Seabright Mill where the Seabright Dam is, and the Seabright Dam creates this body of water, which I've heard it called a lagoon. I've heard it called the Seabright Pond. I don't know, what do you call it, Maggie? Do you have a name for that body of water? Seabright, anyway.
Yeah, so we usually call it the impoundment.
Yes, okay. Here's another picture of the Seabright Dam. This building over here on the right is not part of the mill. This is a ice warehouse. John Brown's ice warehouse. They harvested ice here on the on this pond and used it locally. I don't think this was sent down to the Caribbean like the ice in Rockport, but this was used locally. Maggie did mention the Sanborn insurance maps. There is, I go to the Library of Congress site to find these. These are exquisite and very detailed. Oops, let's get back to that one. What I was trying to do was zoom in here. There we go. You can see the kind of detail that's available on these maps. Back down. And you can see this is the dam, a bridge, and this is a public park. You can walk up along the river here and you will see the remains of all these buildings, or the foundations are still there. Moving down the river to the next mill site is the powder mill site, the Bisbee powder mill. This illustration is part of the decorations on that 1856 base map. At a time when there were 12 or 14 different buildings, part of the Bisbee manufacturing empire. The gunpowder itself was used as part of the lime trade, because you would drill holes and pack them full of gunpowder from Bisbee Powder Company and then blow up the rocks, blow the rocks free. And this is the dam over here on the left. That's the dam across the Megunticook. On that very same Bisbee powder mill site was the Mount Batty Mill, later known as the Hughes Woolen Mill, an enormous building. And so I'm just going downriver, mill after mill after mill, to show you that Camden was full of mills, and the major employers were, of course, the mill owners. This is on the tannery site. It was not built as a tannery. It was built to be the Gould plug and wedge factory, Gould Street, of course. And there, the wooden things that they manufactured were used in the shipbuilding trade. So it was a kind of an integrated business that, because we had such enormous shipbuilding going on in Camden, they had to be provided with wooden goods and iron goods. And that was how the Gould plug and wedge mill started. After that, it was a woolen factory, and after that, the tannery. So this is, when I think of the tannery, this is what I think of. I don't think of an empty tannery site. I used to deliver newspapers here. I picked up my newspapers at Felton's store across the street from the tannery. So to me, this is not history. This is current events. This is history. This goes back to 1881. We've moved downstream to the Knowlton Street Dam, and you can see what an industrious site this was, and the great number of men that they were working there. Here's a line drawing of that very same scene, and the signs on the building say iron foundry, machine shop, rolling mill, and block mill, I think is what that says. Here's an ad for the Knowlton brothers showing that most of their goods went into the schooner building trade. Ships, iron windlasses, pumps, capstans, steering wheels, force pumps, etc., etc. I won't read this description, but in every history of the river, they marvel at the ingenuity of Mr. Knowlton. He could build a machine that would do anything. If you were on the Knowlton Street Bridge and you looked upstream, you would see the Knowlton Brothers Dam. But if you turned around and crossed the road and looked downstream, you would see the Oakham Mill Factory Dam. So this whitewater and this row of rocks here is the remains of this dam, which you see on the right. The picture on the right was taken about 1899, and this picture on the left was taken within a year or two ago. But you can go there yourself. Or in downstream, you see the impoundment, the mill pond above the Knox Woolen Mill. Oh, so what is Oakham used for? Man, Mr. Alden, who owned the Oakham factory, made tons of money generating oakum. And this is what you do with oakum. You pound every seam in the deck and the hull of every schooner. So mile after mile of oakum had to be pounded into place by these guys, whose job it was day after day after day to pound oakum into the seams on the schooners. The next mill downstream is the Knox Woolen Mill, which is supposedly on the site of the original James Richards privilege, but I think it's outgrown the original privilege. We could go on and on about the Knox Woolen Mill. In fact, we have had whole programs on the Knox Woolen Mill. When I was a kid, I had several tours through the mill, and there was a couple of rooms where the women's work was done. And women's work required nimble fingers. That's what they told me. These are heddles, these shafts on the right, and the women would thread the threads through each one of these. It's like an eye of a needle, one after another. And this is the one of the loom rooms in the mill. This machinery looks like it was installed during the Civil War, and indeed it probably was. The equipment that they first built into the Knox Woolen Mill did go in the 1860s, and 120 years later in the 1980s, when the place went out of business, they were still there and still in use. Moving downstream to, I believe it's called the Bakery Dam now, although it was the Brewster Mill, the Penobscot Mill first, and then it became known as the Brewster Mill. Here's another picture of it in 1937. And moving downstream, we arrive at the outlet of the Megunticook River. I love this photograph. It says so much. This is beautiful. This is the L-shaped grist mill dam, which became the Montgomery Dam, and it shows the solid stone wall, which pretty much exists that way today. The feature that does not often show up is over here on the left is another waterfall and dam that supplied power to the Alden Anchor Factory, which is here on the left. And if you could see it up behind our faces, there is a white building, the Ocean View Hotel, which helped me date this. This is clearly before 1903 because the hotel burned down in 1903. And I know that because it's part of the Camden Public Library history. It was on the site of what is now the Camden Public Library. So this is a view from across the harbor of the Alden Anchor Factory, and you can just barely see the flume over here on the right, which is that same dam we were looking at before. And here's the lads who do the work. They are standing, I think this must be one of their larger products, this enormous anchor, and at their feet is one of their smaller products from the Alden Anchor Factory. Now I want to give credit to Camden's greatest benefactor, Mary Louise Curtis Bach, who bought all of the land and paid for Camden Harbor Park, Camden Amphitheater. She contributed to Village Green as well. She had the wherewithal, the means, the good taste to she helped Camden make its transition from being a mill town to being what it is today. She hired the Frederick Law Olmsted landscaping firm to transform Harbor Park. So I have a couple of before pictures. This is what Harbor Park looked like before the Olmsteds got to it. This photograph is from the Olmsted archives. The Olmsteds being a a landscape design firm, were very good about documenting their work. So that's why we have some before and after pictures. Here they are. There's the crew from the Olmsted firm who are scouting out the place. And this was their first product of their work, which was first, of course, a topographical plan of what was in place in 1929. And you can see the L-shaped dam down here. This spillway was about 70 feet wide when the Olmsteds sketched it here, and they knocked down another 30 feet of this big wall so that the spillway is now 100 feet wide. But basically everything is in the same place it is today. This is the heavy-duty retaining wall, and the sluiceway wall runs down here, and the seawall is basically, not precisely, but basically in the same position that it is today. So I have a very few pictures showing the sequence of the construction of the Montgomery Dam. This is early on. They would bring the granite blocks in on barges, and this is how you moved a granite block from one place to another. You used these derricks and swung it from one place. You'd have a series of derricks helping you move the blocks up the hill. Here's a couple of derricks in this picture. And I love this picture just because of this guy here. He is so happy. He's having the time of his life. This is the mill pond over on the right, and the spillway. This guy is standing. Oh, this is the spillway out here. And this next picture shows the spillway is the low wall on the left, and the sluiceway wall is dead ahead of us here. And there's the final result when they were done. This is the Montgomery Dam, probably in the 1930s. This photograph was taken. And it's all thanks to Mary Louise Curtis Bach, who had the vision and the means. She was the only child of Cyrus H.K. Curtis, for whom Curtis Island was named. We owe a great deal of the look and feel of Camden to Mary Louise Curtis Bach. Now we'll pivot from the industrial history of the Megunticook River and ask a pertinent question. What does the historical record say about alewives in the Megunticook? Here is a spoiler alert. Next to nothing. That is to say, there is practically no record or even a mention of an alewife run on the Megunticook River. That begs the question, how can that be? Alewives were crucial to the colonial economy and to the early settlers, as well as to the original natives. Why is the record so scanty? We have tried to turn over every rock in searching for references specifically to alewives and to the Megunticook River. We have, of course, looked for the ideal historical document. The ideal document would be an inventory river by river of the fish runs on local rivers in the 1760s. That would be before any colonial development. That is, before any dams. But of course, that inventory does not exist. The closest we could come is an excellent summary in 1877 by Charles Atkins, and I think this is a well-known piece of literature. He was Maine's Commissioner of Fisheries, and he did a great deal of research to compile his inventory of fisheries. But even his compendium does not mention the Megunticook. So given the lack of references in the local histories, that is in these top three here, John Locke in 1859 and N.C. Fletcher in 1884 and Reuel Robinson in 1907, we turned the question around and asked, what would it have looked like if there had been an alewife run on the Megunticook? The next several slides will try to cover that point. First, we'll back up a half a step and take a look at what the legislative record reveals about alewives, and then what the record shows in our neighboring towns and watersheds. It was immediately recognized that dams and alewives were both vital resources, but were not compatible with each other. The state, that would being Massachusetts at the time, of course, leaned in favor of protecting the alewife fisheries and required that where there were alewife runs, dams must have a way for alewives to pass for a specified number of weeks a year, either by means of a fish ladder or by an open passage through the dam. The state, that is Massachusetts, also established that each town owned the rights to the fishery and could catch the fish, charge for fish, sell or auction licenses for the rights to fish for alewives. And it's an interesting note that a percentage of the fish were always earmarked for the poor. So because we were part of Massachusetts, we have to look in the Massachusetts archives for legislation affecting, we were also in Cumberland County. Beg your pardon, not Cumberland, we were in Lincoln County. So if you should go in and do a search, you have to type in alewives and Lincoln County. Otherwise, you'll get, and I did this, 242 references to alewives in the historical record in the acts and resolves. And if you type in Lincoln County and alewives, you narrow that down to 22 references. This one seems to be the most pertinent. And it, I will summarize it in shorter form than what they have done, but it says, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives that if the fish called salmon, shad, or alewives do or have been used and want to go and pass into the ponds and lakes annually to cast their spawn, then dam owners are required to provide a sufficient passage or sluiceway for said fish to pass up and down in their season of going up to spawn. Jumping back to Camden's history, here is the reference that several researchers have found to the 1806 town meeting, where it was proposed to form a town committee. The language here echoes the 1797 state law requiring towns to form such a committee. And so this 1806 report seems to be a direct response to the requirements of the law. Looking down here at number 6, it says, to see if the town think it, I got a better way to do that, to see if the town think it advisable to choose a committee to examine for the Megunticook stream from the harbor to the large pond above Molyneux's Mills, and should they think it practicable to open said streams and dams so the fish called alewives and others would have free passage into said ponds, then the said committee be empowered to negotiate. More than one researcher has found this reference, and indeed Locke in 1859 refers to this action in the 1806 town record, and his summary is here at the bottom. It appears, however, that no favorable action was taken thereon, as it was referred to a future meeting and thus tabled. So we will turn and ask him the follow-up question, what about our neighboring rivers and towns? How do their histories compare with Camden and Megunticook? And so I am closing in on the finish here, Maggie. I have one slide per town, and I'm trying to cover Belfast, Duck Trap, Thomaston, South Thomaston, and Warren. And here we go. I won't read the whole thing, but Belfast, in their 1877 town history, noted that in the spring and early summer, large quantities of striped bass, alewives, and shad used to ascend the river to deposit their spawn above the head of the tide in Passagasawakag Pond and in the Westcott Stream. Again, we're just trying to establish that that the alewives were present in the historical record. And yes, I did practice saying Passagasawakag. I'm going to say it again because it's kind of fun. It's the Passagasawakag, which gets called the Passy, of course. So here's the documentation. This is a beautiful photograph of the alewife run in the Duck Trap River. This is 1928. And this beam here is actually a chute. So the people would take these dip nets, scoop out the alewives, dump them in this chute, and they would land here in the barrel, and then they would take them quickly to the smoking shed, which I suspect this is the smoking shed. This shack here looks like it was roughly made, and perhaps they built it every year just for the alewife run. In South Thomaston, the stream is the Wessaweskeg, where they noted that in 1865, that very few alewives are being caught in 1865, but in early times, with salmon, shad, herring, smelts, whitings, and eels, the alewives were abundant. This reference to the Mill River in Thomaston, I find particularly interesting. This stream, that is the Mill River, now seldom frequented by alewives, is supposed to have formerly abounded with them as far up as Chickawaca Pond, but from the early erection of a sawmill by Brigadier Waldo near the present mills at the bridge, they were shut out at an early period and the run broken up. So that's a record from South Thomaston and Thomaston. And if you were to look in the Warren town history, you'd hit the jackpot. There are so many references to alewives in the annals of Warren. I'll read you just this one paragraph here. The year 1782, like others during the war, that would be the War of Revolution, was distinguished by a great scarcity of provisions and the difficulty of obtaining subsistence. When every resource was failing and the minds of all were filled with anxiety, Providence seemed in pity to hasten the arrival of alewives, which were caught at the Upper Falls the 27th of April. On the following day, Sunday, large quantities were taken. You're not supposed to fish on Sundays, by the way. That's why they're making a point of pointing out that large quantities were taken as a work of mercy for suffering families. And if you were to look in the Camden Herald, for instance, for references to alewives, you would indeed find references to alewives, and here's what you would find. Every spring, the alewives would hit the market, but as you can see is highlighted in this line, the alewives that you would be purchasing 2 for 5 cents would be smoked Warren alewives. So they would be caught in Warren and brought up to the Camden market. Well, I certainly have taken enough of your time today. We can say that Camden is where it is today because of the Megunticook River, because Camden was built around the river, and more than that, the very boundaries of the town of Camden were drawn so that the mighty Megunticook would be within its borders. Anyway, thank you, Maggie.
Thank you, Ken. That was wonderful. You can stop sharing your screen.
All right.
And Janice, you can elevate any committee members to panelists, but all questions can go through the Q&A. So if anyone, looks like we have some really good attendance today. So if folks have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We have a few right now that I can get started with, and I'll moderate the questions, and Ken can provide us answers or think on those answers. But that was really,
if it's a discussion, that's good too.
okay, great. Well, it's a webinar, so that's it might be a little bit challenging to do that, but okay, so the first question from Ray is regarding the powder mill, and Ray's wondering if it produced gunpowder for the Union Army during the Civil War.
I don't know the answer, but that's a good question. We're kind of far from the action. They probably had closer gunpowder sources, but I would point out that Maine's contribution to the Union Army was in far excess of our, we had a greater percentage of Maine people in the Army and a greater percentage of casualties per population than any state. Sorry, went down a rabbit hole. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, and we have another one here from Ray. In your research on the history of the Megunticook, did you find any historical records that have course changes in the rivers over the years?
No, I have not seen any course changes in the rivers any more than the dam would control where the spillway was so that they could harvest the water power.
I have a question. It's really interesting to hear about Mary Louise Bach's contributions and to the town. My understanding is that the Olmsteds typically did larger projects, so it was a fairly unusual thing for them to work on a project the size of Harbor Park. Is that right?
Yes, that's my understanding as well, but she was well known to them and she had the means. She was she had the, I use the word wherewithal, but she had the contacts and she knew how to get what she wanted out of these professionals. So I think they were that's not the only project that the Olmsted did in town. They also did the Village Green, and they did a project which would have remade Eaton Point, but that project was never done. The plan still exists, but it was never done.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
All right, we've got some questions coming in now. I think folks just took a minute to think about them. One question from David Kibbe from the public. Were there any periods when the water flow was insufficient to run all the mills at the same time, or do you know of any disputes about that, like competing water flow?
No, the dam, the river was never diverted, so any water that reached one dam would be used and then it would flow down to the next dam. So there did not seem to be that kind of controversy. But yes, one of the things in the late summer, the rivers do run low. And so to overcome that, what they would do is hold the water overnight, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, open the sluice gates up at the head, up at Megunticook. And by the time 7 o'clock and the workmen had arrived, that water would be arriving in town for use. And then at the end of the day, they would close the dam again and build up another head of water. So that's how they dealt with the seasonal low water. Other than that, I don't know what their tactics would have been.
Oh, interesting. We have a question from Robin Harlow. So let's see, historians and scientists tell us, prior, let me pull it over here so I can see it. Prior to Europeans settling this area, there was not a stream flowing out of a pond or lake anywhere in the Gulf of Maine that didn't have an annual alewife migration unless blocked by significant waterfalls. Why would the Megunticook River be different?
I don't think the Megunticook River is different, as you said at the end, unless it was blocked by a waterfall. In fact, Atkins himself used very similar language, that the alewives ran every place except where they were blocked by a steep flow of water. So that might be the whole explanation.
Yeah, and I liked how you kind of covered all the different sources and kind of routes that communities have had that documented in their records. Is really interesting. All right. We have a question here. How did the mills handle ice on the river? Do you know?
Flowing water tends not to freeze, so that as far as having water power, they would have had it through the winter. But when the spring rolled around and you had a sheet of ice moving downriver, that could cause a problem. In fact, if you're going to get a flood, it's almost always in the springtime when the rain melts the snow and melts the ice and things start moving.
Right, yeah, you have.
That's a very general answer. I have not read a description of ice and how they would handle it. Would they go out and chop up the ice? No, nothing like that.
Let's see. So this from a member of the public, didn't Mrs. Bach once recommend taking out all the buildings near the river in town due to flooding potential, given the flood during her time?
I never heard of that.
That's totally fine. What happened to the fish hatchery near the east-west dams?
The building itself is still there. It was taken over by the Megunticook Fish and Game Association, and I don't know when they stopped doing fish. I think it was still active in the 1950s. I think in the 1960s, in that time frame, is when they would have stopped being an active fish hatchery.
Great. And if anyone has any additional questions here that's jumped up on the screen, please feel free to chime in.
Yeah, good. I did not anticipate any of these questions. This is great.
I know they're unique. I was wondering, when you showed those huge old looms that were put in at the Knox mill, and you said they were taken out I want to say, did you say the 1980s that those were pulled?
Yes.
Where
See,
do you know where they went or what their reuse was, or if any of them have maintained
no,
or have
good,
been kept
good
around?
question. The
Those are some huge pieces of
that,
equipment.
yes, the company that purchased it, the Knox Woolen Mill, they wanted the business. They didn't want the manufacturing facilities. They wanted the business. There was what the product was of the Camden, of the Knox Woolen Mill was enormous paper felts used in the paper industry. We were part of the paper industry here. And so a company in Georgia was making a similar product and they just bought up the business, did not need the manufacturing anymore. And so they closed the mill. There was a spin-off of the Knox Woolen Mill on Dexter Street Extension down in Thomaston, but I'm not sure if any of that vintage equipment from the 1860s wound up there or not. It's a good question, though.
Yeah, it would be kind of neat to have a piece of that around. Another thing you mentioned when we were prepping for the call was you were talking about how, like, kind of the retirement benefits. I thought that was really interesting. It might be worth sharing with
Yes.
the folks.
My father spent most of his career in the mill, and so I would, after school, if I was going down to see my dad, I would pop into the open door of the mill and walk down this long row of looms. It's just fascinating and loud. I've got to say that every loom master was deaf because it was that loud.
And they probably, I mean, did they wear hearing protection? Do you know?
Are you kidding?
No way.
Yeah. And nobody ever said, "Hey, kid, get out of here." But the retirement package that I referred to was, yes, the retirement package. There was no retirement plan. There was no money set aside. So the retirement plan was they let you work until you couldn't come into work anymore. That was the retirement package.
Which was generous, right?
Yes, they considered it generous because they did not boot you out the door if you were too aged to do the job well. You were family. You were still welcome there, and I've got to say, on my tours, I've got to say there were tons of elderly people working in the mill. And another anecdote is that it was a mill town, and it's hard to imagine Camden as a mill town. We used to walk home from downtown, me and Johnny McGowan, and they would yell down at us, "Hey, get a haircut!" But Johnny knew the right answer, which was, "Hey, get a job." Most of the people in the Knox Woolen Mill were also volunteer firemen, which is right across the street from the mill. And so when the fire whistle blew, you wanted to stand back because everybody in the mill would run across the street, hop on a fire engine, and head off to the fire. I think that's one reason that it's the fire department is struggling to have volunteers, because we don't have a ready-made group of men who are bored at work and are willing to dash off to a fire at the drop of a hat.
Wow, and that was just an understanding between the mill owners and the, I would think like that would be tough if mill operation just ceased, but I suppose fires hopefully aren't that common.
Way too common back then.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would think.
Yeah.
Oh, Courtney, yeah, go ahead.
I wasn't sure if I could speak out loud or.
That's fine. It's a little wishy-washy, but please.
Okay, that you might have mentioned that. So I just wanted to thank you, Ken, very much for this presentation. It's very interesting, and I was curious about your perspective about why there was a transition away from using the mills, and why the dams were kept in place or modified slightly instead of being taken down. And my other question is about the Montgomery Dam. I know that there were some major repairs done in I think it was the 1990s, I want to say. And I was wondering if you could just speak about those repairs.
As far as leaving the dams up, I think the expense of taking a dam down once there was no longer any income for the mill. It's on a dam by dam basis. I know that what's his name, Sawyer, purchased the Seabright Dam and brought it up to snuff and briefly manufactured electricity there. So it's kind of a dam by dam case, but taking a dam down is an expensive project, and maintaining a dam is an expensive project as well. Well, for instance, the Powder Mill Dam, I don't know if it was taken down or just let go. The Tannery Dam was probably taken down. If you go to the Tannery Mill site and look, you can barely see where the dam used to be back there. But I think that dam did not self-destruct. I think it was probably taken down. But specifically, I don't know the answer on a case-by-case basis. I think you just have to take a look at them. And as far as the latest repairs to Montgomery Dam, that's my understanding is also sometime in the 1990s was the last time a major repair work was undertaken there. Does that answer some of your questions?
Yeah, that's great. I was just wondering if you knew any details about the repairs that were done to the dam. What was that done for?
My understanding was that they resurfaced it in concrete and repointed up all the crevices, basically refurbished it. I think they may have put dams tend to have a wooden upstream liner on them to protect them from ice and stuff coming down the river. And I think they probably replaced all that as well back in the 1990s. I'd have to look at the record to be sure precisely what they did, but that would be standard maintenance on a dam like that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Courtney. Oh, go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Ken, you said that was in 1990. Was that before or after the dam was turned over to the town of Camden?
I believe I believe 1992 was the magic date when Philip Montgomery turned it over. So, and I think it was in the late 1990s that the town undertook those repairs. I think one reason for the Montgomery family to pass it on is so that the expense of maintaining it would not be theirs. I don't want to project that thought, but
it didn't sound like you would make those repairs and then 2 years later,
right,
give the dam away. Okay.
All right, we have a few additional questions here. One, just a thanks that this is a great history and the town is lucky to have folks like you who preserve the historical archives. Thank you. So I just wanted to share that sentiment. We have another question. This one you can punt if you want, because I know this is about the history and this question's a bit about the future. Do you know if alewives and other fish would run upstream now if permitted? And any idea on the number of years it would take to reestablish a fish run?
That's a great question, and I think a key question, and it's not my field. I'm not a naturalist. I simply don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, and that was touched a bit on by Nate Gray in our February presentation. So I would recommend going back and watching that one, which is on the town website. And as far as reestablishing the fish run, we sort of touched on that a little bit in our conversation with Mike Burke in March. So both of those presentations might be helpful for that question. We have another one on what is the difference in elevation between the lake and the harbor, and I believe that's about 140 feet. Is that right? Others on the call?
Yeah, I've seen 147. I've seen 150, so it's something. And
yeah, in that range.
Low tide or high tide, that covers the difference there.
Great. We have another question that just came in. Do you have any historical records on past historical floods in Camden? And I'm going to add to that specifically, I would be interested to know if there were historical floods that impacted mill operations.
I don't. As a steward at the History Center here, I have access to photos, and we have the Camden Herald Archives, which is probably the best place to look for photos and floods. But yeah, floods are not that rare. We've got some great photos taken by a photographer, I think John Felton is his name, of a flood out around the Tannery Dam, which flooded the parking lot. And there's this great photograph of water flowing across a bridge from the parking lot following the road. It took me a long time, a lot of puzzling to figure out what this picture was, with water running underneath and across the bridge at the same time. But it was a springtime flood in the downhill from the parking lot at the tannery. So a rare confluence of water flowing above the river below. Sorry.
Maybe you could share that photo and we could
Right, I
add
know
it to
it's
our
odd to
website.
describe a photograph, which, golly, I should have had that photograph here.
Well, we just have a few minutes left. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A. Does anyone on screen have any questions to ask?
Not a question, but just a point Ken mentioned about the Knox Woolen Mill. And there was an article in the paper, I think last week, about the factory down in Thomaston, and they're doing some expansion. And I think they mentioned they had some of the equipment from the original Knox Woolen Mill there.
Oh, thanks, Ray. Somebody else mentioned that, and I was going to look that up this afternoon, and it got by me. But yes, there was a spin-off there. I didn't realize that they took any of the weaving equipment with them, but of course they did.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Thanks, Ray.
Yeah.
I was thinking when you mentioned that the fisheries or fishing would be closed on Sundays, did the mills operate on Sundays or did they close? Were they 24/7?
No, they basically worked in an 8-hour shift unless there was something special going on. No.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Oh.
Great. Any additional questions from anyone before we close? This is really fabulous, Ken. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ken. This was good, really good.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think the
Thank you all.
photos, yeah, the photos really speak to everyone. If there's no other questions, I'm just gonna quickly close by sharing what our next presentation will be. So it looks like no one has their hand up. All right, so great. Well, thank you so much. Our next presentation will be on the third Tuesday in May, which is the 16th, again from 4:30 to 5:30. And we will have Dr. Darren Ranko. Dr. Ranko is a citizen of the Penobscot Nation and a professor of anthropology and chair of the Native American programs and faculty fellow at the University of Maine in the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. So Dr. Ranko will, his talk is entitled Wabanaki Land Relations, Caretaking and Responsibility, Thoughts on the Megunticook. So we will step back in history just a bit farther and expand on the Wabanaki's history on the river. And, Ken has also mentioned, I think we mentioned in the beginning that there's going to be a talk on the Native history in did you say Thomaston, right? Or no, St. George.
Right. The St. George Historical Society is going to host local historian Steve Lindsay on April 27th. And I would share the link with you, but they haven't posted the link yet to his talk. His talk will be on the conquest of Maine, locally about the displacement of the native Mainers when the Europeans arrived. The St. George was the boundary line between the Europeans on the far side and on the near side. By treaty and by practice, Europeans were not allowed in Camden, and that was the boundary line between Indian territory and settlers' territory. Sorry, I go on and on if you ask me the wrong question.
No, not at all. I appreciate it. And so once we get access to that talk, it sounds like a really good complimentary talk in a neighboring community. So we'll post that on our website and we can share it on the listserv if anyone wants to attend that talk as well. So with that, thank you so very much, Ken, and everyone. This was a huge crowd today. I was really pleased to be, I'm not sure if we hit 50, but we were like at 49 people for a while. So that's a really good turnout for our series.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Maggie. Thank you all.